Good day. In what is now becoming a regular habit of his, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov has given an absolutely mammoth interview to the Russian media executive Dmitry Kiselev. Kiselev, I should say, is the head of Rossiya Segodnya, which is the Russian state media conglomerate, which controls a great deal of Russia's external broadcasting. He is also a person known within Russia for his hardline views on relations with the West, which he expresses in extremely trenchant language. I believe I am right in saying that he is on multiple sanctions lists, both in the United States and on the part of the European Union. Anyway, Lavrov, uh, Lavrov's decision to have an interview with Kiselyov provided Lavrov with an opportunity to expand on some of the themes that he's laid out in earlier interviews, which he's had with other journalists and academics, some of which I have discussed in programs on this channel. Perhaps unsurprisingly, however, given that Kiselyov was the interviewer, this was far and away the most trenchant and strongly worded of these interviews. I'm going to say straight away that I believe that these interviews are carefully discussed within the senior levels of the Russian government, and that their purpose is to set out Russia's foreign policy positions and make them known to the outside world, as well as to public opinion within Russia domestically. I say this because though Lavrov is a foreign minister who does regularly give interviews to the Russian media, as well as to the media of other countries, this pattern of repeated interviews, which happens every few days and weeks, is, in my opinion, practically unprecedented. Anyway, let's begin at the beginning. And it turns out that Lavrov made, or says he made, a proposal to Blinken, the US Secretary of State, over the course of their very first telephone conversation with each other, in which he suggested a first step that the United States could take if it really did wish to improve relations with Russia, as both Blinken himself and as President Joe Biden repeatedly say. And the proposal that Lavrov made to Blinken, and I have to say, I think it was both a proposal and a warning, was that the United States cancel all the various restrictions imposed on Russian diplomats who work in the United States, which were imposed by President Obama in the last few weeks of his administration, in the context of the swirling Russiagate allegations which were taking place at that time. This is the sort of thing that Lavrov said. We proposed to the Biden administration, as soon as it had taken the oath and assumed office, the idea, I did not try to press it, I just said that an obvious way to normalize our relations would be to zero out the measures initiated by Barack Obama. Several weeks before leaving office, he was so annoyed he virtually slammed the door by seizing Russian property in violation of all the Vienna Conventions and throwing Russian diplomats out. This has caused a chain reaction. We patiently sat back for a long time until the summer of 2017 before taking any response measures. The Trump administration asked us to disregard the excessive measures taken by the outgoing Obama administration. By the way, that is a reference to that now notorious telephone conversation between Russian Ambassador Kislyak and Donald Trump's soon-to-be National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. It's known that Michael Flynn asked Kislyak to convey to Moscow a request for Russia to show restraint in response to the expulsions of diplomats ordered by President Obama. Russia agreed, and the result was that Flynn was subsequently framed by the US media as engaging in some kind of plot against Kiselev to undermine US sanctions against Russia. That claim, by the way, has been comprehensively disproved, but the legal consequences for Flynn were enormous. Anyway, I digress. That is the telephone. That is what Lavrov is referring to in that sentence. Anyway, then Lavrov goes on to say this. Donald Trump's team, however, failed to normalize the situation, so we took reciprocal measures. However, the Americans have not stopped there. And he goes on in great detail to discuss the various actions the US has taken against Russian diplomats, and also the points about the United States President Biden specifically referring to President Putin of Russia as a killer. And he goes on to say that in light of this, the Russians are going to take their own countermeasures, which is something that they have been pointing out to the Americans for some time. They took countermeasures in 2017 when they expelled a huge number of US diplomats and support staff from Russia. But now they're going to go further, and they're going to deny the US embassy and the embassies of other countries, Western countries that they consider unfriendly, access to locally recruited staff who will carry out the mundane administrative work that is carried out at Western embassies. Now, I've already discussed that recently in a recent video, but it's now clear that Lavrov warned Blinken that this was coming over the course of their very first conversation shortly after Blinken was appointed Secretary of State. Anyway, having got nowhere with Blinken in suggestion that the war of diplomatic expulsions be brought to a stop, Lavrov then goes on to say that the Russians find the behavior of the US administration, as he puts it, schizophrenic. This is what he says. There have been some schizophrenic notes in the statements made by some of the Washington officials. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said a while ago that sanctions against Russia would be continued, that they are producing, by and large, a desired effect, and that their objective is not to escalate with Russia. Even I am at a loss about how to comment on this. I hope anyone can see that such statements are doing no credit to those who are upholding and promoting these policies. So he says, in effect, that US policy has become contradictory and incoherent, and that the Russians are unable to make any sense of what they're hearing from the Americans at this time. On the one hand, the US tells them that it wants a stable and constructive relationship and that it wants to de-escalate. On the other hand, it continues to wage its sanctions war. This is something I discussed shortly after President Biden signed off on his sanctions, and it is clear that the Russians feel that the United States at the moment is in no real position to make any clear decision about its way forward. So these are the general topics that were discussed about US-Russian relations. But the heart of the conversation between Kiselev and Lavrov was clearly about the single most important issue that the Russians are concerned about, which is Ukraine. The first thing to say is that Lavrov once again has referred to the fact and made it very explicit that the Russians will not abandon the people of the Donbass. His exact words are these: President Putin has clearly said that we will never abandon the people of Donbass who are standing up to the openly radical neo-Nazi regime. In other words, if there is a Ukrainian attack on the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, then Russia will respond militarily, and it will do so in an overwhelming and utterly devastating way. And he went on to say, and this is in response to a point made by Kiselev, that the Russians expect and assume that there will be no military action by the Western powers, specifically by the United States, in response to that Russian military action. And again, this is what Lavrov said. It would be senseless to pin hopes on US military assistance. This has always been clear to everyone. If anyone entertained such illusions, such advisors are good for nothing in any government, including the government of Mr. Zelensky. So that is a clear warning to the Ukrainians to place no faith on any expectations of military support from the United States. The Russians are absolutely sure that the US will not intervene militarily on Ukraine's side in the event that Ukraine finds itself in a war situation with Russia, and he is absolutely right about that. In such a war, Ukraine would be left alone and by itself. It would be rapidly defeated and rapidly destroyed, and there would be a quick and decisive end to that military campaign, a military campaign which in an earlier interview, Lavrov said would end with Ukraine itself being destroyed. But then Lavrov went on to discuss further the various contradictions in President Zelensky's policies, and he made it absolutely clear Russia's total indifference and complete lack of respect for Zelensky. He made it entirely clear that as far as the Russians are concerned, Zelensky's entire effort to speak to Putin and to set up a summit meeting with Putin is simply a device by Zelensky to portray the Russians as in some way a co-belligerent in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. They've made it absolutely clear that they will not agree to that, and for that reason, there will be no such summit, at least no such summit, whilst Zelensky continues to insist on discussing the topic of eastern Ukraine at that summit with Putin. And I'm going to again set out clearly what was said as follows. This in the interview. Now, these words are from Dmitry Kiselev. President of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, cannot get a call through to President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, who is not picking up the receiver. Your Ukrainian counterpart, Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba, cannot get a call through to you. What does this mean? Why is this? Lavrov. This means that they are seeking to revise the Minsk agreements and represent Russia as a party to the conflict, even in this area of their activities. Requests that came in until recently, both from my counterpart Kuleba and Zelensky, dealt with the topic of settlement in Donbass. We replied that this topic should be discussed not with us, but with Donetsk and Lugansk, as agreed under the Minsk agreements. The agreements say in black and white that the key stages of settlement should be the subject of consultations and coordination with Donetsk and Lugansk. When they say that a nasty situation is looming large at the line of contact and want to talk to Minister Lavrov and President Putin, they are barking up the wrong tree. And that, it seems to me, essentially puts paid to any idea that a summit is ever going to take place. And then Lavrov goes further because, of course, he not only ridicules Zelensky's ideas of holding a summit, but he also has scathing things to say about the Europeans. He says that the Europeans, the French and the Germans, negotiated or helped the Russians to broker the Minsk agreements, which set out the requirement that the Ukraine negotiate directly with the two breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. But having brokered those agreements and having insisted that those agreements be implemented, the French and the Germans have proved incapable of doing so. The result is a deadlock of the crisis in eastern Ukraine and a situation where, in Lavrov's words, this has caused the entire crisis to hit a brick wall. So the result is that the Russians, from time to time, apparently get from the French and the Germans requests that they somehow revise the Minsk agreements in order to try to help the Ukrainians come to some sort of accord with them. And Lavrov made it absolutely clear as crystal that that is not going to happen. And here are some of his words. I believe that the brunt of the responsibility lies with the West, because only the West can make President Zelensky honor the commitments which his predecessor signed and he himself signed in Paris in December 2019, when he, the presidents of Russia and France, and the Chancellor of Germany reaffirmed the absence of any alternative to the strict observance of the Minsk agreements. And he pledged to amend the legislation and the Ukrainian constitution to formalize the special status of the Donbass on a permanent basis. So he has made it completely clear that the Russians will not in any way budge from the position that they have taken. And he is not only unequivocal about this, but he also says the following. Today, the moral and international legal truth is on our side and on the side of the Donbass militias. I think that we must not let Mr. Zelensky and his team off the hook, writhing as they might. Mr. Zelensky's statement is a fine specimen when he had all but given up hope of turning the Minsk agreements upside down, to the effect that they are no good, albeit necessary, because the saving of the Minsk agreements guarantees that the sanctions against Moscow will be preserved as well. We ask the West what they think about this. They just look aside shamefacedly and say nothing. I think it is a shame and disgrace when an international legal document is held up to mockery in this manner. The West, which has co-authored this document and supported it at the UN Security Council, is demonstrating absolute helplessness. Now, these are scathing words. What he's basically saying here is that the Western powers, knowing perfectly well that the Ukrainians are never going to implement the Minsk agreements on their own, nonetheless find it impossible to force the Ukrainians to carry out their commitments to carry through the Minsk agreements. And he says that is a shame and disgrace. But notice also his words. We must not let Mr. Zelensky and his entire team off the hook, writhing as they might. I mean, that clearly refers to the present situation now, when Zelensky has moved his army to the contact line, finds he cannot advance, but is afraid to retreat and is desperately looking for some sort of solution that will allow him to withdraw his troops, but say that he has achieved something by deploying them there. The Russians are not prepared to help him. They say that they will not let him off the hook. Well, there we go. There are all sorts of other remarkable things in this remarkable interview. Lavrov goes to great length to discuss, for example, the bizarre story of with the Czechs, the expulsions of diplomats that have taken place there. He talks about Bulgaria doing the same thing recently. He says mockingly that before long, Russia will be accused of assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's the event which, of course, triggered the First World War. But it is the key point is the issue of Ukraine. It seems to me now absolutely crystal clear that the Russians, if they are going to be persuaded to do what the Americans and the Europeans say they want, that is to reach some kind of agreement with the Americans and the Europeans, at least for a predictable and stable relationship, for the establishment of what is known as some kind of mechanism to stabilize relations. The Russians have made it entirely clear that as far as they're concerned, some movement on the political settlement of the Ukrainian crisis on the basis of the Minsk agreement, the original Minsk agreement, as actually signed, that is absolutely essential. The Russians do not believe that there can be any improvement in Russian Western relations until that happens. I am not certain about this, but the strong words that are coming from Lavrov on this topic suggest to me that for the Russians this might even be a make or break issue with the summit itself. I am far from convinced that there will be a summit meeting between Biden and Putin, as the Americans say they want, unless the Russians are given some concrete assurance that there will be movement from this point forward with the situation in Ukraine. Lavrov, however, clearly is extremely skeptical about the American and Western ability to do that. He makes points about how the Europeans are incapable of enforcing the very agreement which they themselves brokered with the Russians in Minsk. But he also speaks with absolute ridicule about certain other aspects of Western policy. He mentions, for example, the bizarre charade which takes place every year when the Western group of nations, the G7, meets. The G7 invariably announces in advance of that meeting that Russia has not been invited to attend. The Russians have repeatedly pointed out that they have no wish to attend and that they regard the previous G8 format, which they once attended, as completely redundant and obsolete, and that they have no interest in reviving it. They have made this point to the Western powers repeatedly, and yet the Western powers continue, in disregard of that, to say that Russia has not been invited to a meeting which Russia has no intention of ever attending. He cites this as an example of the completely surreal quality of much of Western foreign policy nowadays. He makes it also, incidentally, very clear that he blames the British for many of the problems that are arising in East-West relations. He says this: the British continue to play a very active, serious and subversive role in relations between Russia and Europe. Britain has withdrawn from the EU, but it has not slackened its activities there. On the contrary, it has been trying to exert maximum influence on the EU countries' positions towards Moscow. This is not surprising at all. And then he goes on to discuss at extraordinary length the Navalny, Skripal, and Litvinenko affairs, before finishing with these words. Getting back to Britain, we can see that London is continuing its anti-Russia policy. Chief of the UK Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, Richard Moore, said a few days ago that Russia is a declining power whose allegedly reckless behaviour needs to be dealt with. This is inherent arrogance and a belief that they continue to rule the world. They are sending signals to us and propose establishing ties. In other words, they're not against communicating with us, but they are trying to discourage others from doing the same. This could be an aspiration for a monopoly of contacts and a desire to prove that they are superior to others. What he's essentially saying, and it's very interesting, is that the British in private have been telling the Russians that they want to re-establish a dialogue with Moscow, but that they're doing that at one and the same time as they're encouraging all the other European states to cut back their dialogue with Moscow. The fact that the British in private are making overtures to Moscow is something which Lavrov has disclosed, and which, to my knowledge, has been disclosed for the first time. Anyway, this has been a fascinating interview. What it shows overall, in my opinion, is the profound skepticism that the Russians have that there is any hope of an improvement in relations with the West at the present time. As far as they are concerned, US policy is chaotic and dysfunctional. Britain is completely, obsessively hostile, even as it wants to try and re-establish some sort of dialogue with Moscow, and the European states simply can't get their act together at all, whether on Ukraine or on any other issue. The Russians look at the situation in the West and they see chaos, confusion, and hostility, and they are increasingly pulling back from it all with disgust. At least that's the impression I get from this interview, and I am sure that it is the impression the Russians want to convey. Well, what can be done? What steps could be taken to try to restore some sort of order to relations between the West and Russia? I'm going to express my own view. I think, again, the United States at this moment in time is perfectly serious about the desire, at least of some people in the administration, to improve relations with Russia, or at least to stabilize them. I've already discussed this at length in previous videos. I think that the US generally wants some kind of at least stable situation in Europe so that it can refocus its energies on facing down the challenge from China. The Russians understand this perfectly well, and they feel that their position is getting stronger. Lavrov, in the same interview, discussed at length the steps they're taking to organize their financial system in preparation for a disconnection from SWIFT that I suspect they believe one day will come. They seem to believe, Lavrov seems to believe, that they're ready for it. And I suspect that they are now confident that their economy has become essentially sanctions-proof, and not only sanctions-proof, but that from now on it will actually grow and grow rapidly despite whatever sanctions the West throws at it. So the Russians feel themselves getting stronger. They've seen that the various talk of standing by Ukraine in military terms is a military bluff, and one which they know they can call whenever they wish. And at the same time, they sense that the United States, feeling the pressure from China, wants to some extent to disengage from Europe so that it can focus on China instead. So they are hardening their position. Now, that leaves the ball back in the West's court. It is for the West to decide what to do. If it really does want this kind of stabilization of the situation in Europe, then they need, in the West and in the United States especially, to accept the reality that some sort of deal on Ukraine must now be done. And that means agreeing that there should be movement for a settlement of the Ukraine issue on the basis of the Minsk agreement. At the same time, it's obviously essential that this war of diplomatic tit for tat, with each side busy expelling the other side's diplomats, be brought to an end and, if possible, reversed. Is the West prepared to make those sort of concessions? Is it prepared to go that far? I have to say, I see no sign at all that it is. We have in the West this bizarre situation where people understand, more and more people understand, that this crisis in Europe is a distraction from the challenge posed by China, and that it is imperative, if the West is going to try and get itself organized to deal with China, that it ends this crisis in Europe, but that it lacks the ability and the imagination and the will to bring that crisis to an end. Given that that is so, I'm far from confident that we're going to see a resolution of anything at any time soon, even if that summit in June does eventually take place. We shall see. Thank you for joining me for this program, and thank you also for checking your subscription to this channel. Please also remember to check out our other videos that we do on our main channel, The Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's own channel. Also, please remember to look us up on our other platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, Odyssey, and of course also support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Remember, we accept donations in all currencies, including the new digital electronic ones. Last but not least, please check out our Discord server and come to our shop. Thank you very much for joining me for this program, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel, and have a wonderful day until then.